Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining today's webinar on social network analysis. I'm Angela Robinson. I'm a member of the Graduate Student Committee for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, otherwise known as SPSSY. Today's event is a joint effort of SPSSY and APAGS, the American Psychological Association of Graduate Students, and this is the first in a joint series of methodology webinars that will continue over the next several months. So we have 1 hour for today's webinar, and before we get started, I'll give you a quick overview of what to expect. So we'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping information, and then you'll briefly hear from Eddie and Sarah, who are staff members at APAGS and SPSSY, about some of their upcoming events and opportunities. And then I'll turn it over to Joanna Weil, who is today's main presenter. During the last 10 to 20 minutes of the hour, Joanna will be taking audience member questions. So just to touch briefly on housekeeping items and how to ask questions throughout the webinar, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. Joanna will be answering questions at the end of her presentation, but you're welcome to submit those questions at any time during the webinar using the chat feature. So now I'd like to introduce Eddie, who will say a few words about upcoming initiatives of APAGS.
Hey everybody, this is Eddie Amin. I'm here in Washington, D.C. as the Assistant Director of APAGS, and I'm also excited to announce that I will be transitioning to the role of Director of the APA Office on Early Career Psychology in just a couple of weeks. So if you're an ECP, or will soon be one, I hope to welcome you in that new position, that new office for APA very shortly. And to let you know about APAGS, we are a home to about 25,000 students who desire to improve society through psychology. We have staff here in our DC office, although a lot of our positions and focuses are set by our governance members, students who decide to serve on APAGS's main committee or many subcommittees. So I encourage you to check out those opportunities to get involved. We're here to build a better future for psychology by serving as a united voice to enrich and advocate for graduate student development. And currently we're focused on 3 core items. Number 1, ending the internship crisis. If you are a student, a doctoral student in clinical counseling or school psychology, you know about this crisis, and we're doing what we can to help increase the number of accredited internships. We're also developing powerful training opportunities for scientists, and this is one great example of that. And then creating a culture of leadership in psychology. One of the ways that we're kicking off that is by a brand new leadership institute that will debut this summer at APA's convention. There are 4 big reasons I think that everyone should be an APAGS member, and here are the 4. Professional community. Number 1, reason I think is that people want to be a part of something bigger than themselves, bigger than the campus that they're on, so they find an association that speaks to their needs. One of the ways that we encourage professional community is by giving discounted admission to APA's convention this August in Denver, as well as free convention registration to first authors that are graduate students. As a member, in 1 year you'll receive 13 issues of academic journals, including the American Psychologist and the APAGS-sponsored Journal of APA, which is known as Translational Issues in Psychological Science. You'll get the Monitor on Psychology 10 times a year, and then 4 issues of Grad Psych, which is a magazine specific to the needs of graduate students. You'll have access to over 200K across APA and student grants and awards, and then you can do a number of things related to your own professional development. Our Leadership Institute, a mentoring program, serve as a governance member of APA, participate in listserv discussions, write for our blog, and much more. So I hope you'll consider if you're not already a member of APA. And if you are, now you know about some of those resources that you may have forgotten about. Check us out at apa.org/APAGS. Also like us on Facebook. We post every weekday, and we usually have some pretty neat and useful information. Here are just some of the things that you can find on our website for free. So thanks a lot, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Eddie. And now we'll hear from Sarah on upcoming opportunities through SPSSY.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Mancall. I am the Policy Director here at SPICY. And for those of you who aren't familiar with SPICY, we are also known as Division 9 of APA. We have over 3,000 scientists from psychology and related fields, and their common interest is really conducting and learning about research on psychological aspects of important social and policy issues. So just to orient you to a few upcoming opportunities that may interest grad students, we have our 2016 conference in Minneapolis in June, and I will be organizing, in collaboration with SPICY's Policy Committee, a one-day policy workshop which will be held on June 23rd. It's only $25 for grad students, and it's a great opportunity to learn about how to connect research to public policy. We also have a number of current grant opportunities, including the Social Issues Dissertation Award, which is an award of up to $1,000. The deadline is May 1st, and you must have defended your dissertation by that deadline. We also have the Grants and Aid Program, which is open to both graduate students and non-students, for awards of up to $1,000 for grad students and up to $2,000 for non-grad students. That deadline is May 15th. And the Clara Mayo Grants Program, which offers awards for research related to sexism, racism, or prejudice, and that deadline is May 15th. We also have annual fellowship opportunities, the James Marshall Public Policy Fellowship, which places a doctoral level researcher in Congress for a year. That award season has closed for this year, but the next deadline will be February 1st of 2016. And the Dalmas A. Taylor Memorial Summer Minority Policy Fellowship, the deadline for that will also be next year, so be on a lookout for that. And you can learn a lot more at our website, www.spicy.org. One more quick plug. We have a Research Methods and Social Relations Handbook, which is very useful. It includes all sorts of great information on research methodology. It covers a wide variety of traditional research methods, including new research approaches, and it's written to be accessible to a range of social and behavioral science disciplines, including but not limited to psychology. And it also includes new chapters on building sustainable partnerships in field and community settings. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to Eddie and Sarah both for making today's event possible. So with that, we're just about ready to begin the main presentation. So our presenter today is Joanna Weil. She's a PhD candidate studying social psychology and the law at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I wanted to mention that in addition to other leadership roles that she's held, she was previously the chair of SPICY's Graduate Student Committee. Her research examines how prisoners are treated as outsiders by society and how this impacts their re-entry back into the community. She has extensive training in a variety of research and statistical methods, including social network analysis. So thank you to Joanna for leading today's presentation, and I will now turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Angela, and Eddie and Sarah. Let me just get my screen set up here. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today. Like Angela said, today I'm going to be talking about social network analysis, and particularly how it can be used in psychology. I'm finishing my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, where I research questions at the intersection of psychology and the law. Today I'm going to be giving a very basic introduction to using social network analysis. It's really designed for people who've not used social network analysis before, but are interested in possibly using it as a methodology in the future and want to find out a little more about it and how to use it so they can make a decision about whether it might be right for them to use. So a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to go over just kind of the basics of what social network analysis is. I'm going to be talking a lot about data collection. We'll touch briefly on data analysis and hypothesis testing. And then I'm going to go into some examples from psychological research where people have used methodology before. And I also want to talk to you about different resources you can use if you want to find out more about how to use this methodology. So social network analysis is really a growing field with the number of articles that are published on the topic actually tripling in the first decade of the 21st century. And you may have heard about it as the methodology for collecting and analyzing data, but it's really a lot more than that. It's a way of learning and thinking about the world that focuses on the relationships between units. And when I say units, usually we're talking about people, but it can also be groups of people, organizations, buildings. So you can really look at the relationships between a lot of different things. But throughout most of this presentation, I'll probably be referring to people because that's what we usually use it to study. So when I say a network, social network analysis, what am I talking about? So a network usually includes nodes, ties, and sometimes attributes to these nodes. And so the nodes are often things like I mentioned before, units like people or organizations. But it can also be a combination of these things. Sometimes we'll see multimodal networks where we have both some nodes that are people and other ones that are organizations, and we're looking at the relationships between them. And then when I say ties, I'm talking about the relationships or connectors between these nodes. And sometimes in other type of network research, you may hear these ties called edges. So here's our first example of a picture of what a social network would look like. And this is actually a social network of the history of social network analysis, which I find kind of entertaining. And so what we see, we have the circles are the nodes I was referring to, and the lines between them are the ties. And the lines between them in this diagram are showing how individuals who worked in the same field or had influences on each other. And we can see that the nodes are colored in different ways or shaded in different ways, and these are indicating node attributes. So for here you can see, based on the node attributes, whether they are working in psychology or sociology. And you can also see from this image that people are coming from all different fields to use social network analysis. So what type of questions can social network analysis help us answer? And these are just some examples I made up. It can help us look at things like what type of people have the most influence on our eating habits? Who are the best resources to help new immigrants find employment? Which students should be included in an intervention program to change discriminatory attitudes in a classroom? Or do racially diverse businesses function differently than homogeneous businesses, and if so, why? So social network analysis can be used to help address all these questions. So there's two different types of social networks, and social network analysis that's done. The first type is called sociocentric analysis, and the second type is called egocentric analysis. So sociocentric analysis is looking at whole networks. You create one network, and all your data is within that one network. While egocentric analysis is really about looking at individuals' personal networks. And usually you end up creating many standalone networks, one for each of your participants. So another way to think about the difference between these two types, in the words of Helgen and DeJordy, they say that sociocentric is used if your research question is about different patterns of interaction within defined groups. Opposed to egocentric, you'll use if your research question is about phenomena of or affecting individual entities across different settings. So we'll be seeing a lot more examples of sociocentric and egocentric networks. So hopefully this will become clearer as we go along. So here's our first image of a sociocentric network. Like I said, this is a whole network, and this particular network is actually every character who makes an appearance in one Harry Potter book. I think it's actually maybe Order of the Phoenix. So it's a whole network because we're including all the characters, and what they did in this network is the characters are connected by these different lines we see if they're acquainted with each other in the books. And then the colors and sizes of the different nodes can be used to demonstrate different characteristics. Some other examples of sociocentric networks you may have seen going around online recently. There was an example of the Game of Thrones characters, and some mathematicians used sociocentric analysis to look at who is the main characters of the books, trying to determine who's really the main character. Kind of more traditional uses of sociocentric analysis would be looking at everyone that works in a particular company, or maybe everyone who serves on any board of any Fortune 500 company. These would all be examples of sociocentric analysis. And so the intention is really to include everyone who makes up this network. Whether it's possible to include everyone is a different question, but that's really the goal of a sociocentric network. And really all the data you collect is going to create this one network. Now, contrasting this to an egocentric network, we're creating one of these networks for each participant we have. So this is an example from my own dissertation data, and this is just the network of one participant, who we call the ego. And then the individuals that we see in this network are all the people in that participant's network, and we usually refer to these individuals as alters. So the ego is connected to all these alters in their network. The ego isn't actually in this visualization because we know they're connected to all of them. But what the visualization tells us is how the people within their network are connected to each other. And usually in egocentric analysis, the ego is telling us information about all the people in their network, rather than finding out from each person within the network themselves. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about data collection. There's a lot of different ways to collect data for social network analysis, but we're going to talk about mostly, so first of all, you can construct networks with the help of the people in them. And so this is usually through doing surveys or interviews, or kind of a combined survey interview. And that's really mostly what we're going to be talking about today, kind of this creating the networks with the help of the people in them. However, you can also construct the network yourself using pre-existing data or observation. So kind of to give you an example of what I mean by this, the example I was talking about with the boards of Fortune 500 companies, I could look online and get all that information about who sits on the boards of the Fortune 500 companies, and then I can determine who's been on the boards together. Maybe they're serving on multiple boards, and I can draw lines between individuals who've been sat on the same boards. So with that, I don't need to talk to anyone involved in the network. I can collect that data myself and put it together. Another example would be I could look at prison records and see who's been housed in the same units and make a network that way. I could also use observation to create a network. So I could observe a classroom and see who interacts with each other and create a network in that way. And of course, you could do a combination of this as well. You could survey people at a company, but also use their email records to see who's been in contact with each other. So we can combine that pre-existing data with surveying and interviewing. Okay, so when we're collecting information for a social network, there's three questions we need to answer. The first is who's in the network, and this is going to give us information about our nodes. We need to determine what are the characteristics of the people in the network, and this is going to give us information about node attributes. And then we need to know how they're related to one another. And this is going to give us information about our ties. So I'm going to go through each of these and kind of give examples of how we would collect information about the nodes, attributes, and ties. So first, to determine who's in the network, we really need to decide what the boundaries of our network are going to be. So for a sociocentric study, the network boundaries are often very clear. For example, we may be looking at everyone who works at a particular company or everyone in one classroom of a school. So often the boundaries are predetermined for us. However, if you're doing an egocentric study, you're going to have decisions you have to make about what the boundaries of your network is going to be. Because, for example, you could be asking about everyone that an ego spoke with in one day, or you could be asking them to list the 20 people they're closest with, or you could be asking them to who they would ask to borrow money from. So using each of these questions is going to give you different nodes, different people in their network. And it's really going to depend on what your research question is. So you have to think carefully about what you want your network to include when you're doing an egocentric study. Then we have to figure out what are the characteristics of the people in the network. So when I say characteristics, you may be interested in finding out the age of the nodes in your network, the gender, job title. There's really an unlimited number of things you could find out about these nodes. However, you can imagine if you ask many, many of these questions, it's going to be a very, very long survey or interview. So really, it's important to kind of focus in on which attributes are the most interesting to you. The information can be obtained in a variety of ways based on what your research question is and the practicality of asking them. So you could ask the individual themselves to get the information. So let's say you're interested in age. You could go to Bob and say, okay, Bob, how old are you? You could ask someone else about Bob's age. You could say, how old do you think Bob is? Or you could use pre-existing data or a database to look at how old Bob is according to company records. But of course, this really all depends on what type of information you want to get. Does it matter if you have Bob's exact age, or do you really want to just know how old Bob seems to others? That may determine whether you're going to use, it's okay for you to ask an ego to report back on other people's characteristics, or if you really need to hear from the individuals themselves. Typically, in an egocentric study, you're asking the ego to report on their alters characteristics, but in a sociocentric study, often you speak to everybody within the network and have them report on themselves. So here's kind of an example of what you might do once you have this attribute information. You can visualize the network in different ways. So in this particular, I ordered the nodes based on whether they're male or female. I believe red is male and blue is female in this particular image. And so I can just kind of start to provide us with some information. You can see that it looks like, their network is mostly female, and there's kind of a group of men that are all connected up on the left side. And you can take the same network and look at different attributes mapped onto it. So for this one, I've colored, like I mentioned before, I do psychology and law research, and this is a network of a man returning from prison or jail. And I asked them, what are the relations? What is their relation to the people in their network? And so in this particular image, the black nodes are service providers, people providing them with services, probation officers, substance abuse counselors. The red nodes are family, and the blue nodes are friends. And so we can see that they have one side of their network that's all service providers and one side that's mostly family. And this just starts to kind of give us some information about how their network is configured. And then we need to find out how the people in their network are connected to each other. So whether the nodes in your network are going to be connected really depends on what your research question is. If your research question is relating to trust, let's say, you might ask questions along the lines of, who would you go to for help with a personal problem? And that will determine whether there's a tie between two individuals in a network. However, if you're interested in something more like information flow across a network, that's going to give you different ties. So for example, in that case, you may want to ask something along the lines of, who did you speak to yesterday? Or in an egocentric study, you may ask, do person A and person B speak to each other when you're not around? So whether those ties exist are going to depend on, what you're really interested in looking at. And additionally, I want to mention that the ties within a network can have different strengths and different directions. The ties between two nodes could be, they could be very likely to speak or not, somewhat likely to speak. And the ties there could be a tie that goes from person A to person B, but not from person B to person A. And we don't really have time to go into that in detail today, but that is something to think about when you're designing your study. Oh, and sorry, here's another example. In information flow, you could also use records and look at who emailed each other this week. And also, sometimes people ask multiple questions to look at the ties between networks. This is a multiplex study. However, you can imagine that looking at the ties between all the nodes in your network can take a very long time. This is often the longest part of the study. So the more questions you ask about the relations between each person, your study will start to get very long. Okay, so now I have some examples of studies I want to show you. So this first example here might be used if you were interested in communication in a certain office place. I would give this survey to everyone in the office. This would be a sociocentric study. We're looking at the whole network and within this office. How are we going to get the information to determine who the nodes are in this network? Well, the network boundaries are pretty much predetermined. It's everyone who works in this office space, right? But then we hand out this survey to everyone in the office, and they're all going to fill out this top information here. And this is going to give us the node attributes for each person in the network. The bottom part of this survey, and we ask them to put an X next to everyone they speak with in a day, is going to give us the tie information for the study. And we'll learn how each node is connected with every other node based on the individual's responses here. Now here's an example of an egocentric study. Egocentric studies often start or end with some kind of our general survey questions, demographic information. Maybe here I have a stress scale that I put into my dissertation. So we usually have questions about the ego themselves. But then, different than a normal survey, we often have a name generator. And this is how we determine who the nodes are in their network. So this is kind of a variation of what I used in my dissertation. We ask people to come up with a list of people they know. They can list up to 25 people. And we give them different criteria that the people have to meet. There's some standard criteria out there, but then I also add this criteria in that they need to list people who are not currently incarcerated. So there's a variety of ways to generate names. This is the one I chose. So after they generate their names, these are going to become the nodes in the network. And now we need to determine the node attributes. So in this survey here, we can see that each individual in their network, here we have Sam and Bob, and we can assume they're asking about more nodes farther down. And we're asking 3 attribute questions about each individual. Here we're asking each node's age, their relation to the participant, and how close they are with each participant. And again, if you ask many attribute questions, you're going to end up with a long survey, so something to keep in mind. And all 3 of these questions will get asked for every single node. Now, finally, in an egocentric study, you also need to find out the relationship between every individual in the network. So, for example, in this one, I ask, what is the likelihood that Bob and Sam talk to each other when you're not around? Then Bob and Valerie, Sam and Valerie, and this is going to have to happen between every connection, every node in the network. So again, you can imagine this can take quite a long time to do. And this is difference between egocentric and sociocentric studies. In sociocentric studies, you can ask, one individual how they relate to each of the other people in the office, but in an egocentric study, it's going to take longer to make these, to determine the ties, because you have to ask one individual about the relationship between everyone else in the network, not just between themselves and the people in the network. However, egocentric, I'm not saying that egocentric is the harder version to do necessarily. Sociocentric studies can also take a while because even though the individual surveys might not be long, it may be hard to get everyone in the network to fill them out. So you may be held up in other ways. Okay. So I want to talk very briefly about if you wanted to use pre-existing data to create a social network. You know, I wanted to find a pre-existing data set online that could be used for this presentation. So I went to my own university's campus directory, and I just typed the title professor into the position title in the directory. And it, you know, that pulls up most of the professors in the university, not all of them. And then if you see here, there's a little button that says download CSV, which is basically an Excel file. And I downloaded that, and it gave me this collection of data. And just using this data that I got from the director website, if I wanted to, I could create a social network of all professors at the university or in the university directory who have similar department affiliations. You know, I have their department here, but I also have their other affiliations. So we could connect these and see how the department affiliations cluster. So that's just a very easy example. It might not be something you're actually interested in. Maybe you don't, it's not that interesting a question, but just to show you, there is data online that can be used to do this. Okay. So social network analysis is not simply creating visualizations of the data, which is very interesting, but doesn't necessarily answer your research questions. Once you have this data, you're going to need to analyze it. So you can use the data you've collected to create different quantitative measures of the networks. Now, there are a lot of measures out there for social network analysis. I can't even possibly begin to go through them all. I've just picked out a very few here to tell you about. But basically, if you're looking for a certain way to get something in this network, there is a measure out there for it. So the most basic one would be size of network. Does this person have a small network, a large network? You can quantify that pretty easily. But you can also look at the composition of the network. So the proportion of people who have certain attributes, or the number of people in the network who have certain attributes. So for example, you could look at what proportion of the network is male, or how many people in the network are male. However, we can also create measures that really get at the structure of the network. So one of the most popular ones is density, which is the proportion of all possible ties that could exist that do exist. So I'll show you a picture just to explain that, what I mean by that. So in this image, the network on the left has a lower density. We can see that all the possible ties that could exist, the nodes don't necessarily connect to a lot of the ones they could connect to, right? They're only connected to a few here and there. But on the right-hand side, each node is connected to many more of the other possible nodes it could connect to. So this network would have higher density. And this might be interesting to you if you're interested in information flow across a network. So if your research question is something to do with how quickly does information travel from one type of person to another type of person, this may be something interesting to you. Another way to look at the structure of the network is you might be interested in the number of components or the number of unconnected subgroups in the network. So in this particular image, we can see that we have, let me actually pull up a little pen here so I can draw. We have one unconnected subgroup here, one large component, and then we have a smaller component here of just 3 people. And we have an individual here we call an isolate. I don't know if we'd necessarily call them their own component. And so this could be interesting to us if, again, you're interested in information flow or something like that. But for example, in my own research, I'm interested in components because I want to know that if individuals may harm their relationship with one group of individuals, do they still have another group of individuals that they can turn to for support? So, and another thing to mention, right now this component is just connected by this one line here. If this line in the middle didn't exist, we would have 3 components, right? So you can also look at an individual's position within a structure of a network. And one of the most popular measures of these is a measure of centrality, trying to determine how central a certain node is to the network. So there are a lot of different types of centrality, but I'll mention 2 here. Degree centrality is looking at the number of connections that a certain node has. So for example, let me get my pen up again. This node here has a 6 ties coming out of it. So it would have a higher degree centrality than, let's say, this node, which only has 4. However, something like betweenness centrality is based on connecting the paths between other nodes. So, for example, this individual in the center here, these 2, may have fairly high betweenness centrality because they're connecting the paths between all these individuals on this side and the individuals on this side. We can also look at closeness, or the shortest path between 2 nodes. So for example, the path between this node and this node, the closest path would be 2, 1, 2, but going from this node, the blue one, to our far end red one would be a path of 3. So this may be interesting to us if we're interested in how quickly information travels across the network. We could look at how long it takes to get to one individual, or we could even look at the average closeness of people in the network. Okay, so once we have, I think one of the other presenters might have their mic on. If maybe you could mute it, we're getting some feedback. So once we have these measures, we can do hypothesis testing with them. So I'm not going to go too much into this, just very briefly. For egocentric, these types of measures just can be basically used as normal variables. You can calculate each of your participants' networks. Let's say you have a density score for person A, you have a density score for person B, and you'll just use them as normal variables. So it's pretty simple for egocentric. However, for a sociocentric study, it's going to be quite a bit more complicated. So just to kind of give you an example, in sociocentric study, your research questions may be something along the lines of, are people with more ties more successful? Do people prefer to be friends with people of the same race? However, the problem here is that when the people we're referring to in all these research questions are all part of the same network. And so you can imagine this actually violates many of the standard assumptions of inferential statistics. The observations are not independent. We're maybe working with non-random samples or working with a population, and the distributions are going to be unknown. So usually what we have to do in a sociocentric study is we're going to have to use some sort of non-standard hypothesis test, like a permutation test. And I believe one of the most common ones is called QAP, QAP. And don't get too overwhelmed. You're not going to have to learn completely new statistics to be able to do a sociocentric study. There are softwares out there you can do these tests kind of in a point-and-click way, just like SPSS. So you'll have to understand kind of what they're doing, but you don't necessarily have to know how to do them, by hand for yourself. Now I also want to briefly mention the data management that's required for social network analysis. I was going to include some slides on this, but I don't think we quite have enough time. So I just want to throw out there that the data management in social network analysis can be complicated. I'll just kind of leave it at that and tell you that if you're interested in doing social network analysis, I would definitely read up more on how you need to manage your data. You're going to need more spreadsheets than you normally need for standard analyses, and you need to know how to kind of put them together. So something to think about. Okay. So now we're going to move into talking briefly kind of about social network analysis and psychology. So even though social network analysis isn't used a lot by psychologists today, actually a lot of the early social network analysis work was done in psychology. Moreno, who's really considered kind of one of the fathers of social network analysis, was, I believe, a psychiatrist. And Kurt Lewin also did some work that was considered to be social network analysis. Like I said, not quite as common in psychology today, though I'm going to give you some examples of researchers who have been using it, psychologists who've been using it in really interesting ways. And part of the reason I think it's not used quite as much today in psychology is that in psychology we often see stable behavior, look at stable behavior patterns across situations, right? And this is kind of personality, we're looking at stability. However, many psychologists, especially social psychologists like myself, are interested in the impact of other people and environments on behavior. And so we could see how social network analysis really does seem like a logical methodology to use for these types of questions. So the first psychology study I want to go over with you was done by Alan Clifton, a professor at Vassar College, who is a personality psychologist and a clinical psychologist. And he's actually, this is some of the research that I worked on as a research assistant when I was an undergrad. So it's a study that I feel very personally connected with, and actually kind of initiated my interest into social network analysis being used in psychology. So Clifton's main research question was, how is personality expressed across different interpersonal relationships? So his method was that he had 2 studies with undergraduates, and each participant was asked to list 30 people in their social network. And so this was an egocentric study. He asked, in addition to many other things, how they would rate their personality when interacting with each member of their network. But then at the end of the study, the research assistants, with the permission of the participants, selected informants from each area or cluster within the network to contact and report back on the personality of the ego. So what we end up having is information from the ego and how they think they act with different people in their network. And then we end up having information from the people in their network on what they think the personality of the ego is when they're around them. So Clifton found that personality expression did vary across these interpersonal situations. And he also found that the informant's ratings of the ego's personality were similar to the ego's ratings of their personality with those informants, even after controlling for a global personality self-report. Additionally, in both studies, the egos rated themselves as more neurotic, more extroverted, and less conscientious, with alters in the center of their network. So those are kind of the main takeaways from Clifton's work. So now I'm going to move on to another study. This work was done by community psychologists, both at UC Santa Cruz and U Washington. Langhout et al. Their participants were 12 Latino, Latina, and or immigrant children in a youth participatory action research after school program. And so this study was actually multi-method. They did interviews, they used a bunch of different things, but one of the methods they used within their study was social network analysis. So the overall goal of their study was to examine students' relational empowerment. However, the research question that really related to social network analysis was, how and in what ways do young people link their worlds? And so this is I mentioned before that some studies are multimodal, that they may have different types of nodes within their network. And that's what this study was. It was a two-mode social network analysis technique. They asked students to nominate both worlds they occupied and people in those worlds. So worlds could be things like school, sports, the Youth Participatory Action Program, but then they also listed people in their lives as well. So I've just pulled a couple of findings out of the study. There's a lot in there, but I wanted to kind of highlight some of the things that are most relevant to what we've been talking about. So Langhout et al. Found that family and friends were more likely to bridge worlds than were teachers and others. This was also a longitudinal study. So they found that in year one, there were the most bridges or connections or ties between home and family. And in year two, there were most bridges were between other institutions. They also found that the average density of the networks increased from year one to year two, so that their networks were becoming more integrated as time passed. So here's some images from their study. The interesting thing about this is they actually mapped all of their the networks from each of their 12 participants on top of each other. So we see that the lines are thicker when there are more connections in all these networks between two different things, like here we see home and family. So if you remember from the results, they found that home and family, there was a lot of bridges between home and family in the first year. But when we go to time two, we can see that most of the bridges are between school and friends. Where the line is thicker, it means there are more bridges there in the networks. Additionally, if you remember, they found that the network was less dense in time one and more dense in time two. And we can see that as well in the second time the network is more integrated. So touching briefly on some of the ways I've been using social network analysis in my dissertation work. My work's kind of coming out of this idea that a lot of previous research has demonstrated the need for social support for successful reentry after incarceration. So what I'm really interested in, how does incarceration experience predict the differences in social support networks during reentry? So how might the history and their incarceration experience, whether coming from prison or jail, whether they've been incarcerated far from home or close to home or for long periods of time, how their networks are going to look different after these experiences. So to do this, I'm mapping the networks of men returning from jail and prison in Santa Cruz County. I do a 1 to 2 hour kind of computer-mediated interview. And I have participants list up to 16 people they know. They can list more. If they know more than 16, they list the 16 they're closest with. And I only include non-incarcerated people in their networks because I'm interested in their support outside of prison and jail. We've collected about 60 networks to date, and we're hoping to get at least up to 70 in the next few months. So I want to show you just a little sample from one of my participants' networks. We haven't analyzed the data yet, but I think some interesting things are starting to come out. So one of the things we asked our participants was which of the people in their network they would go to for instrumental support. So instrumental support is kind of a more physical support, you know, who would you turn to for housing, for food, for money, and those types of things. So in this picture, blue are the people that this individual said they would go to for instrumental support, and red are the people they said they wouldn't go to for instrumental support. So we can see it's mostly to the left side of the network that is giving them instrumental support. However, in the second picture, I've layered other network attributes on top of this by changing the shape of the nodes. Now the nodes that are shaped as circles, which you can see there are 4 on the left, are individuals that the ego has not been in contact with since their release. So we can see that everyone who they're not in contact with anymore is someone they would go to for instrumental support. So it seems like they're losing sources of instrumental support here. So in this third image, you know, I wanted to find out who are these people that they're losing support from. So I made the nodes larger in this picture if the people are formally incarcerated. And so we can see that the people who offer him instrumental support but who he's not in contact with anymore are also all other formally incarcerated individuals. So, you know, it kind of leads to the question, is it good or bad he's not in touch with these people? He has less instrumental support, but also less people with, less contact with people who may also be entrenched in crime. So, you know, it kind of leads to the question, if they're putting crime behind them, are they also losing some key support? And if we end up seeing a pattern of this, it may give us information about who is going to need additional help with instrumental support as they're coming out of prison or jail. So kind of what we're going to end up doing to analyze this, we're going to look at individuals' incarceration history, look at how this may predict different network features, like the different measures I went over with you guys, and ultimately looking at how this may predict different measures of success, like psychological well-being and hopefully recidivism. Okay, so I think we have time really quickly to go through these resources before we take questions. So if you're interested in doing social network analysis, there's a bunch of great readings out there. Wasserman and Faust is kind of considered to be the Bible of social network analysis, though I do think it seems a lot more useful for sociocentric than egocentric work. Most of social network analysis research is sociocentric. This book, Analyzing Social Networks, is a really great book to start you off with. It's really easy to read, and there is a chapter on egocentric if you're interested in that. So I think this is a really great starting place. I am personally also very excited because they just came out at the end of this past year with a book just for egocentric work. It's the first book like it, and I've started reading it. It seems like it's really great, really easy to read. So I would recommend looking into this as well if you're interested in egocentric studies. There's also a handbook on social network analysis that I think is really great because it's divided by interest topic. So if you want to kind of get an overview of what's been done in crime-related research on social network analysis, you can get an overview of that. If you're interested in policy, you can get an overview of what's been done on that. So there's a variety of free and not free software that can be used to do this work. For data collection, there's things like EgoNet and EgoWeb. These are both free softwares that allow you to collect egocentric data. Both Qualtrics and SurveyGizmo, from what I've heard, have the capacity to collect social network analysis data. And just to kind of back up a little, the reason you need this particular software is you can imagine that the different types of questions we asked about the tie connectors particularly are going to be hard to ask with general survey software. Additionally, with this software, you can also usually create the network on the spot so your participants can see it and they can give feedback on it as well, which is nice. I'm not familiar with the software, but it sounds really interesting. If you're interested in collecting social network analysis data from Facebook, I hear there's an app for that, NameGenWeb. Then, of course, there's a lot of social network analysis specific tools for data analysis and data visualization. UCINet is the big one. eNet, InVivo, I believe, has some as well. NetDraw. We're running low on time, so I'm going to skip through this quickly. There's a lot of great workshops out there. I attended the Link Center last summer. I thought that was great. If you want to go all the way to Barcelona, you can go to an egocentric workshop as well. And there are some courses on Coursera as well. Okay, so we've reached the end. I'll take some questions now. And thank you all for coming.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Joanna. So I think we'll have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So I'll prioritize the ones that were maybe asked by multiple people. So the first was on the maps that you created, does the physical distance between the nodes mean anything about the relationship between those nodes?
It's funny, I've gotten this question a lot. I think So this is all, I don't decide where the nodes get placed. That's done by algorithms in the computer software. So I assume it is done, you know, with some sort of logic in place. However, the maps are really intended as a visualization and not necessarily as a way of analyzing anything. So I wouldn't take too much out of where the nodes are placed, but of course, you know, if one individual is connected to a lot of different nodes, they're not going to be placed on the side of the network, right? So there is some information to be obtained from where it's placed, I think. It's obviously the people that are most connected and most central are probably going to be in the center of that network. But it is a good question, but I think a lot of it's based on the software algorithm, but I'm sure there's more information out there. I can look into it more for people if they want to email me about it.
Great. Okay, and the next question is there a hybrid approach that combines the sociocentric and egocentric approaches?
Yeah, there is. I'm not that familiar with it, but I know a lot of people who do sociocentric studies will sometimes do pull egos out of their sociocentric network and look at the individuals within that. So I'm not exactly sure how that works, but that is done. Actually, I think a lot of the great thing about this new manual from, I think his name's Crossley, about egocentric is it focuses on kind of pure egocentric analysis where you're kind of just looking at completely individual people. But most of the other work out there in egocentric is looking at kind of egos within larger sociocentric networks. So there's definitely hybrid work out there that you can find.
Great. And then kind of a related question. So the common SNA measures that you presented, are those applicable for both sociocentric and egocentric analyses?
Sorry, I missed the very beginning of what you said, just the list of the measures I talked about?
Yeah, the common measures that you presented.
Yeah. It depends on the measure. You know, often in egocentric, size will be the same because you're asking people to list a certain number of networks. Actually, size, well, maybe that wasn't a great example. But, you know, it varies. I think most of them you can find a way to use them for both types of networks. Certain ones, I believe like density, you're going to have to control for the size of the network, which may vary for certain types. You know, I for example, centrality is probably something that people are more interested in for sociocentric networks, but it's not necessarily means you can't use it at all for egocentric. So I would say generally they can usually be used for both, but they might not be as interesting for both.
Okay, great. And we'll just do one last question. Is there a way to kind of keep the entries anonymous to kind of protect the participants' anonymity?
So a lot of these softwares, like I mentioned, I've heard there's ways you can do it on Qualtrics. If you can make your normal Qualtrics stuff anonymous, you could probably make this anonymous as well. For sociocentric, I have a feeling it'd be pretty hard to make that anonymous. At the workshop I went to at the Link Center last summer, there was actually a whole session on IRB things, because for sociocentric, the IRB things can be quite difficult because obviously you need to know exactly who the people are to be able to kind of, let's say you're looking at an entire company, nothing's really going to be anonymous there. You know, everyone knows, everyone works there, who's working. So there are a lot of confidentiality and IRB issues for sociocentric studies. For my egocentric studies, for my egocentric studies, I don't find that to be a problem at all because it's just the same things that I would do for a normal participant confidentiality and stuff. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. So that wraps up the time that we have available today. So I'm going to wrap things up now. Joanna, would it be possible for you to flip back to your slide about the types of software that are available with the list like UCINet and things like that while I wrap things up? Great, thanks.
And also, sorry, go on, Angela.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and as you guys may remember, this is going to be available online as well, so if you need to see this slide more later.
Yeah, great. Okay, so thank you so much to Joanna for giving this great introduction to social network analysis. We really appreciate you sharing this information with the group today. And thank you to ATAGS and SPISI for supporting the event.
Unmuted.
Absolutely.
So
This was so awesome. I learned so much. Thank you, Joanna.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. So as Joanna mentioned, today's presentation was being recorded, and the recording is going to be posted online so that you can reference this information in the future. So you'll receive follow-up information via email about how to access that recording. And we have some great future webinars planned in the methodology series. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time as well.